It was 2 in the morning. The city was asleep, and an old man coat, worn thin, hands trembling, laid his last few coins on my counter and couldn't afford a 129 dinner roll. I gave it to him anyway. My manager saw it on camera, called me foolish, said the world doesn't reward kindness. He was almost right. Because that old man, he was one of the wealthiest people in the Pacific Northwest. And what happened next changed my life in ways I will never stop being grateful for. I've worked a lot of jobs in my life. Dishwasher, delivery driver, warehouse loader. But the one I remember most, the one that started everything, was the overnight shift at a little convenience store on the corner of Maple and Fifth, right in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon. I was 23 years old and I had nothing. No family to speak of. No savings worth mentioning. No safety net if things went sideways. Just a beat-up pair of sneakers, a name tag that read Jamie, and enough stubbornness to keep showing up every single night. That particular night in January was the kind of cold that gets inside your coat and stays there. The kind that makes your nose run before you've even stepped out the door. Portland winters can be deceptive. People think of the Pacific Northwest and picture rain, not ice. But that winter was brutal. The kind of cold that reminds you that nature doesn't care how tired you are, how hungry you are, or how alone you feel. The store was quiet, the way it always got after midnight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. One of them had been flickering for 3 weeks, and the manager kept saying he'd fix it, and he never did. The hum of the refrigerator units filled the silence. Outside, I could see the orange glow of the street lamps through the glass door, and beyond that, the empty street. I was standing behind the counter trying to stay awake by reorganizing the candy display for the 3rd time that week when the automatic door slid open. A gust of cold air rushed in ahead of him. He was an old man, maybe mid-80s, I'd guess now, though in that dim light. He seemed ageless in the way that very old people sometimes do, like someone who had lived so long that time had simply stopped trying to count him. He wore a gray overcoat that had seen better decades. His hat a simple wool cap. Dark blue was pulled down over his ears. His shoes were clean but worn, the kind of shoes a person keeps polishing long after they should have been replaced. He moved slowly, deliberately, like each step was a small decision he had to make on purpose. I gave him a nod. "Evening," I said. He didn't answer right away. He just looked around the store with those quiet, careful eyes, the way someone does when they're not entirely sure what they came in for, or maybe when they're not entirely sure they deserve to be there. He made his way to the bread aisle, which is generous, because it was really just half a shelf, and stood there for a long moment. His hands were in his coat pockets. He looked at the wrapped rolls, the packaged muffins, the small loaves that were left over from the day shift stock. Finally, he reached out with a slightly trembling hand and picked up a small dinner roll. Just one. The cheapest thing on the shelf marked $1.29. He carried it to the counter like it was something precious. "Just this," he said. His voice was low, a little rough around the edges, the kind of voice that had told a lot of stories over a long lifetime. "Of course," I said, and I reached to scan it. That's when I noticed his hands. He had pulled a small collection of coins from his coat pocket, the kind of coins you find in the bottom of a jacket you haven't worn in a while. He started counting them out on the counter one by one. A quarter, a dime, 2 nickels, another dime. He squinted slightly as he added them up in his head. His brow furrowed. He counted again. Then he looked up at me, not with embarrassment exactly, but with a kind of quiet dignity that was somehow worse than embarrassment. "I'm afraid I'm a little short," he said. "I apologize. Let me just..." He reached for the roll to hand it back to me, and I don't know exactly what happened in that moment. I can't fully explain it, even now. It wasn't a calculated decision. It wasn't me thinking, oh, this will look good, or maybe this will come back around. It was just reflex, instinct, something older than thought. I picked up the roll and put it in a small paper bag. Please, I said. Take it. On me. He looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. I can't accept that, son. It's cold out there, I said, and I smiled. Because what else do you say? Cold night like this, you don't want to be out there hungry. Makes the cold feel twice as bad. He was quiet for a moment. Those old eyes of his moved over my face, like he was reading something there that I couldn't see myself. Then slowly he took the bag. Thank you, he said, and his voice just for a second cracked like old wood. That's very kind of you. He turned and walked toward the door. Slow and steady. The automatic door slid open and the night air rushed back in again, cold and dark and indifferent to all of us. He stepped out into it without hesitation, pulling his coat a little tighter. I watched him go. The street lamp caught his silhouette, that slight stoop of the shoulders, the careful pace, the wool cap, and then the darkness swallowed him up and he was gone. I stood there for a while after that, just standing. The flickering fluorescent light buzzed above me. The refrigerators hummed, and I thought about something I hadn't thought about in a long time. I thought about being 14 years old, standing outside a diner in the rain, too hungry to go home and too proud to ask for help. If you're finding the story compelling, please hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Your support helps us share more important stories like this one. Now let's continue with what happened next. My mother got sick when I was young. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it shaped everything that came after, the way a river shapes the land around it, quietly and completely. She'd had a cough for as long as I could remember. At first, it seemed like nothing one of those background sounds of childhood, like the creak of the stairs or the way the heat kicked on in winter. But by the time I was in 3rd grade, she was seeing doctors regularly. By 5th grade, the pill bottles on the kitchen counter had multiplied. By the time I started middle school, I had learned to cook simple things. Scrambled eggs, soup from a can, grilled cheese, because there were nights when she didn't have the strength to stand at the stove for long. She never complained. That was the thing about my mother, Margaret Hartwell. She was not a woman who complained. She'd grown up during hard times, the daughter of a factory worker in Michigan, and she had a constitution forged from stubbornness and black coffee and the belief that you kept going because you kept going, and that was all there was to it. But bodies don't always honor our stubbornness. The winter I turned 14 was the winter the heat stopped working in our apartment. The landlord said he'd fix it. He didn't. We couldn't afford to go anywhere else, and my mother was too sick to fight with him about it. I remember sleeping in my coat. I remember seeing my breath in my own bedroom in the morning. And I remember the night I came home from school to find the refrigerator nearly empty and my mother asleep, or what I thought was asleep on the couch. I stood in that cold kitchen for a long time. Then I put on my coat and went outside. I walked for a while without any particular destination. The kind of walking you do when you don't want to think. The downtown streets were lit up, restaurants exhaling warm air through their vents, the smell of soup and bread drifting out onto the sidewalk like a taunt. Everything warm was behind glass. Everything good was just out of reach. I ended up standing in front of a small diner called Miller's. Through the window I could see people eating. A couple sharing a plate of fries. An old man with a newspaper. A woman in a red coat who laughed at something the waitress said. I must have been standing there a while, because the door opened and a small woman with silver hair and a flour-dusted apron leaned out and looked at me. "You've been standing out there in the cold for 10 minutes, she said. It wasn't a question. I didn't say anything. I was 14. I didn't have words for what I was feeling. She just stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come in out of the cold," she said, simply. No pity in her voice. Just an instruction. She sat me down at the counter and put a bowl of beef stew in front of me. Warm bread on the side. A glass of milk. She didn't ask me to explain myself. She didn't ask if I had money. She didn't look at me with those eyes that some people get, the ones that make you feel like a problem to be managed. She just said, "Eat." And I did. I didn't realize until the first spoonful hit my stomach how hungry I'd actually been. The warmth spread through me like something being restored, like a light coming back on in a dark house. My eyes burned. I kept my head down so she wouldn't see. When I finished, I thanked her. She waved her hand like it was nothing. "You come back if you need to," she said. I walked home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not happy exactly, but possible. Like maybe things could still work out. Like the world had a little more room in it than I'd thought. I have never forgotten that woman. I never got her name. I never went back to that diner my mother passed away that spring. I went into the foster system, and that part of Portland became a neighborhood I couldn't bring myself to revisit. But I have never forgotten what she did. And standing behind that convenience store counter, watching the old man disappear into the dark, I understood for the first time that I had just done the same thing for someone else. Whether it would matter, I had no idea. I had no idea at all. The days after that night passed the way all my days passed, slowly and all at once. Morning shifts, evening shifts, overnight shifts, restocking shelves, mopping floors, making change, smiling at people who didn't look at me. I thought about the old man sometimes. Wondered where he'd gone. Wondered if the roll had been warm enough. If he'd found somewhere dry to sleep. If he had people somewhere who were looking for him. You think things like that when you've been alone most of your life? You recognize loneliness in other people, the way they carry themselves. The careful way they move through spaces as if apologizing for taking up room. He'd had that quality. Something about him was deeply familiar in a way I couldn't name. What I did not think about, not even for a second, was that he might come back. But I did think quite a bit about what happened 3 days after I gave him that role. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were the days the district manager made his rounds, which meant everyone was slightly more tense than usual. And the store had that particular energy of people trying to look busy without actually doing anything different. His name was Gerald Fitch. I want to be clear about Gerald Fitch because he matters to this story, and not in the way you might expect. Gerald was not a villain in the storybook sense. He was simply a man who had learned to see the world in a very specific way through columns of numbers, spreadsheets, loss prevention reports. The world for Gerald was a series of profit margins, and anything that reduced those margins was, by definition, a problem. He was maybe 45, wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent, had the kind of hair that looked like it had been shellacked into place and would survive a hurricane. He smelled like expensive aftershave and certainty. He came through the door that Thursday evening while I was alone at the counter, pushing his way in with the particular stride of someone who owns the room before they've even entered it. He stopped in front of me. "Didn't say hello. You the one who gave away the roll?" he said. I looked at him calmly. "I helped a customer who was short a little change," I said. "Yes, I pulled the security footage," he said. "Watched the whole thing. He waited, like that was supposed to make me feel something. I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned a long time ago that showing fear to people like Gerald only encouraged them. "You know what that's called?" he said. "Loss. Inventory loss. You took a product and you gave it away without authorization, which means this store eats the cost. And you think that doesn't matter?" I didn't say anything. "I'll tell you how it works," he said, and now he had the tone. The one that men like Gerald use when they've decided to educate someone they've already decided is beneath them. One store gives away a 129 roll? Fine, who cares? But we've got 47 locations in this region. 47. You start multiplying these little charitable gestures across every location, across every shift, and you know what you've got. You've got a budget problem. You've got a management problem. You've got a you problem. He put his hands flat on the counter. "You work a job like this," he said, and here his voice dropped just a notch, took on a particular quality. I recognized immediately the quality of someone about to say something they know will land hard. You don't get to make policy decisions. You're here to run the register. That's it. I absorbed that. I let it sit there between us for a moment. "I understand," I said. "I'm not writing you up this time," he said, "but I am docking it from your check. And if you do it again, you're done." "We clear?" "Yes," I said. "We're clear." He held my gaze for another second, the kind of stare men like him use to make sure the point has landed properly, and then he turned and walked out. The door slid shut. I stood there in the quiet. Here is the honest truth, his words hurt. Not the part about the roll or the docking of my pay, those were consequences I could absorb. What hurt was the implication beneath it all. "Do you work a job like this?" The subtle, practiced dismissal of my entire existence compressed into a single phrase, delivered with the effortless cruelty of someone who has never had to think very hard about how their words land on other people. I had heard variations of that phrase my whole life. "You come from nothing, Jamie. Don't get your hopes up. People like you don't usually. People like you." I had been a people like you since I was old enough to understand what it meant. I sat down on the stool behind the counter and looked at my hands. Steady. I made them steady on purpose. I breathed slowly, the way I'd taught myself to breathe in hard moments. The way you learn to breathe when you've had a lot of hard moments and you need to keep going through them. And I don't know exactly why this happened right then. At that specific moment, I thought of the woman at Miller's Diner again. She hadn't asked whether I deserved the stew. She hadn't calculated whether feeding me was good policy. She'd just seen someone cold and hungry and opened the door. I thought, what if she had thought the way Gerald Fitch thinks? I would have stood on that sidewalk until my feet went numb. I would have walked home empty, and maybe I would have lost something that night that I could never have gotten back, some small, remaining piece of belief that the world had room for me in it. She hadn't done that. And so I hadn't done that. I sat there in the quiet of the store, the fluorescent light buzzing, the refrigerators humming, and I made myself a very small, very private promise. Whatever comes, I thought, I won't be sorry for it. I didn't know, sitting there, that I would be tested on that promise almost immediately, and I didn't know that the test would come from the most unexpected direction imaginable. 10 days passed. The store, the register, the overnight quiet. The same faces, more or less, cycling through the construction workers who came in at 5:30 for coffee, the night shift nurses from the hospital. 2 blocks over, the college kids who bought energy drinks at 2 in the morning, with the particular glazed confidence of people who don't yet know what tired really means. I had mostly stopped thinking about the old man, not because I didn't care, but because I'd learned early in life that dwelling on things you can't change is a luxury, and I didn't have the budget for it. He'd come in, I'd helped him, he'd gone. That was the whole story as far as I knew. Then Gerald Fitch walked back through the door. It was late, close to 11. The store was empty. I heard the door and looked up with the automatic customer service expression I'd developed over years. And then I saw who it was, and I reset my face to neutral. But Gerald looked different this time. The shellacked hair was still in place. The suit was still expensive. But the certainty was gone. In its place was something I'd never expected to see on a man like Gerald Fitch. He looked rattled. He came to the counter slowly without the usual proprietary stride. He put both hands on the countertop, and for a moment he just stood there, like he was organizing thoughts that had gotten shuffled out of order. "I owe you an explanation," he said, which was not a sentence I expected from him. I waited. He exhaled. "The man you helped the other night. The old man with the roll." "Yes," I said. "His name is Walter Harrison." I didn't recognize it. I said nothing. Gerald looked at me steadily. "Walter Harrison, as in Harrison Capital Group? As in 42 years of building one of the largest privately held investment firms in the Pacific Northwest." He paused. "He's our parent company's majority shareholder." The store got very quiet. I heard the refrigerators humming. I heard a car pass on the street outside. I heard my own breathing. "He was here because he does this sometimes," Gerald said. And now his voice had gone low, almost reluctant, like a man reading from a confession. "Goes out in old clothes, no wallet, just a few coins. Walks into ordinary places. He said he started doing it years ago to stay grounded, to remember what real life feels like. He's been doing it since he retired from running the company day to day." I thought about the old man's hands, the careful way he'd counted those coins, the dignity in his face when he realized he was short. "He came back," Gerald said. "Not here," he called the regional office. Asked about the night clerk at this location. Said he wanted to find the young man who helped him. Gerald reached into his jacket pocket and placed a business card on the counter between us. It was a simple card, cream-colored, good stock. The name on it was printed in clean, modest letters, Walter Harrison, Harrison Capital Group. Beneath it, a phone number handwritten in ink. "He asked me to give you that," Gerald said. He said. Gerald stopped. Seemed to be choosing his words. "He said he'd like to meet you properly, if you're willing." I looked at the card for a long moment. Then I looked up at Gerald. Gerald, for his part, looked like a man who was doing the right thing and wasn't entirely sure he deserved credit for it. "I also want to say," he started and then stopped again. I waited. "What I said the other night," he said. "The way I talked to you. That was," he pressed his mouth together. Gerald Fitch was clearly not a man well practiced in apology. "That wasn't right. What you did was a good thing. I'm in the business of reducing loss, and sometimes I forget what the actual cost of things is." He said it stiffly, imperfectly, but he said it. I nodded once. "I appreciate that." He straightened up, and some of the old Gerald came back into his posture, the squareness of the shoulders, the contained professional manner. "You should call him," he said. Then he turned and walked out. The door slid shut again. I picked up the card. Walter Harrison. I turned it over in my hands. Turned it back. Looked at the handwritten phone number and thought about what it meant, and what it might mean, and whether I was the kind of person who was allowed to find out. I set the card on the shelf below the counter, and then I got through the rest of my shift, and the shift after that, and the one after that. 4 days I waited. I'm not sure what I was waiting for exactly. Permission, maybe. Or certainty. Or the feeling that I was ready for whatever was on the other side of that phone call. But readiness is a feeling I've learned to distrust. You're rarely ready for the things that matter most. You just have to go ahead and do them. On the fifth day, just before my shift started, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the store and dialed the number. It rang twice. Jamie Hartwell? The voice was calm, clear, with the particular ease of someone who has spent a lifetime being comfortable in conversation. My heart jumped slightly. Yes, sir. That's me. I'm glad you called, Walter Harrison said. I was starting to wonder if you would. I wasn't sure I should, I said honestly. There was a brief, warm sound, almost a laugh, but quieter. That's honest. I respect that. A pause. I'd like to meet you in person if you're open to it. Not to make a big production of things. Just I'd like to talk. Properly. I took a breath. I'd like that too, I said. Good, he said. Come on Thursday. I'll have someone send you the address. And just like that, the door opened. Thursday came. I wore my best clothes, which weren't much a collared shirt, dark pants, shoes I'd polished the night before. I took the bus downtown and stood in front of the Harrison Capital Group building for a full 5 minutes before I went in. The building was tall and glass-fronted and entirely indifferent to how nervous I was, which I suppose buildings always are. The lobby had marble floors and the kind of quiet that expensive buildings always have, a hush that feels intentional. Like silence has been installed as a feature. A young woman at the reception desk smiled at me and said Mr. Harrison was expecting me. She walked me to an elevator, pressed the button for the 14th floor, and sent me up. The elevator doors opened into a sitting room filled with afternoon light. High windows looking out over the city. Good furniture, not showy, just solid and warm. A low table with a pot of coffee and 2 cups already laid out. And there he was. Walter Harrison. He was standing when I came in, which surprised me. A man of his age and stature you might expect to be greeted from a chair. But he stood, and he extended his hand, and his grip was firm and dry and held just long enough to mean something. He looked entirely different from the man I'd met in the store. Different and exactly the same. The face was the same, the deep lines, the careful eyes, the slight stoop of very old shoulders. But he was dressed in a good wool suit, and his bearing had a quality that I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe hadn't had the context to recognize authority. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Jamie, he said, sit down, please. We sat across from each other at the low table. He poured coffee for me first, then himself, and he didn't say anything right away. He just looked at me with those eyes. And I had the strange feeling of being seen very clearly by someone who had seen a great deal. I want to tell you something first, he said, about why I was there that night, and why it mattered. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Outside, the city hummed 14 floors below. I built this company over 40 years, he said. Started with nothing. My father was a postal worker. My mother cleaned houses. I worked my way up through the kind of jobs that teach you about the world from the ground up. Loading docks, night shifts, positions where you learn who people really are because nobody's performing for the cameras. He looked out the window for a moment. When I stepped back from running things day to day a few years ago now, I realized something had happened to me. Not all at once it sneaks up on you. But I had gotten insulated. The people around me were people who agreed with me, who managed me, who made sure my days were smooth, and I had stopped seeing clearly. He turned back to me. So I started going out, not often, just sometimes. Old clothes, a few coins. No phone, no cards. Just me and the world, the way I used to meet it, before all of this. He gestured slightly at the room around us. I wanted to remember what it felt like to need something small, to be uncertain, to be just a person. He paused. And then, he said, I met you. I didn't say anything. My coffee was warm in my hands. I've been in that store before, he said. Other nights. And the way people look at you when you're old and poorly dressed, shuffling around counting change, it's educational. People look through you, or they look at you with a very specific kind of pity that is really about their own discomfort. Or they get impatient. He set down his cup. You didn't do any of those things. You just saw me and helped me, without making a production of it, without expecting anything. He smiled, then a real one, not the polished kind. Do you know how rare that is? He said. I shook my head because I didn't know what else to do. Rarer than you'd think, he said quietly. We sat for a while. He asked me about myself, and I told him the condensed version. The one that doesn't include every dark detail, but doesn't leave out the important shape of things either. The foster system. The jobs, the years of showing up and keeping going without anyone keeping track. He listened the way old people listen when they've learned that listening is more valuable than talking. Fully, without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you want, Jamie? Not what you've settled for. What do you actually want? Nobody had ever asked me that. I mean, nobody. Not a social worker, not a teacher, not a manager or a supervisor or a coworker. The question assumed that what I wanted was worth asking about, that it was real, that it mattered. I had to think about it. I want to do something that means something, I said finally. I want to build something that helps people the way I needed help. But I don't know how to get from where I am to that. Walter Harrison nodded slowly, like that was exactly the right answer. What if, he said, I helped you figure that out? What Walter Harrison offered me was not a check. I want to be clear about that because I think it's the most important part of the story, and it would be easy to get it wrong. He didn't write me a big number on a piece of paper and send me on my way. That would have been simpler, maybe. It also would have been the wrong kind of help. What he offered me was a chance to learn. He knew people at the local community college, not just the president of the school, but the professors who actually taught the courses that mattered. He made some calls. He paid for my first 2 semesters of business courses, quietly, through a scholarship that he set up without putting his name on it. He said he'd learned that people learn better when they don't feel like they owe someone their entire future. He also gave me time. Every other week, I would come back to that 14th floor sitting room and we would talk. Sometimes about business, he taught me how to read a balance sheet, how to think about investment, how capital moves through an economy. But more often, we talked about other things, about what it means to lead well, about the difference between building wealth and building value, about the people who had helped him along the way and the debts he'd never been able to fully repay. He talked about a man who'd hired him for his first real job despite a thin resume and no connections. He talked about a professor who'd told him he had a gift for seeing patterns other people missed. He talked about his late wife, Dorothy, who had kept him honest for 53 years and whom he missed every single day. And gradually, over months and then years, I began to change. Not dramatically, not like in the movies, where there's a montage and suddenly everything is solved. Real change is slower than that, and messier. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's passing an exam you didn't think you'd pass and then failing another one you thought would be easy. It's learning to trust your own thinking while still being willing to be wrong. I finished my associate's degree. Then I went back for a bachelor's in nonprofit management. I worked through most of it different jobs, but better ones. I paid my rent. I put a little aside each month, which was something I had never been able to do before. Walter attended my graduation. He sat in the third row with a cane he'd recently started using, and when I crossed the stage, he was the loudest person clapping. For a man who carried himself with such quiet dignity, he had a remarkably enthusiastic clap. I went to him afterward, still in my gown, diploma in hand. "Well," he said, "there it is." "There it is," I agreed. He shook my hand. Then he pulled me into a brief, firm hug, the kind old men give when they don't hug often, but mean it completely when they do. "Now," he said, stepping back, "what are you going to do with it?" "I started a foundation." I know how that sounds. I know "I started a foundation" is the kind of sentence that can sound like something only certain people get to say. People with connections, people with resources, people who come from somewhere. And I won't pretend it was easy or that I did it alone. I had help. I had Walter, who made introductions and provided seed funding. I had professors and mentors and a small group of volunteers who believed in the idea before there was much evidence that it would work. But the idea was mine, and it came from a very specific place. I called it the Open Table Foundation. The name came from that night at Miller's Diner. The woman who opened the door and sat me down and put a bowl of stew in front of me without asking why I needed it. The open table, the seat that's waiting for you even when you didn't know you were welcome. The Open Table Foundation does several things. We fund meal programs at community centers in underserved neighborhoods, real meals, cooked fresh, not processed, shelf-stable packages. We work with local restaurants to create pathways for people experiencing food insecurity to eat with dignity at a table like everyone else. And we run a small mentorship program connecting young people who aged out of the foster system. Kids like I was with professionals who are willing to give time, guidance, and honest conversation. Not money necessarily, time, which is the thing that nobody in the system ever had enough of to give. I sat for an interview once, a local news station. Nothing big, and the interviewer asked me what I'd learned from all of it. What the main lesson was. I thought about it for a long time. "I think the main lesson," I said, "is that a small thing done at the right moment can be enormous. It doesn't feel enormous when you're doing it. You're just opening a door or handing over a bowl of soup or putting a roll in a bag and saying, 'Take it, it's cold out there.' You don't know what it means to the person on the other side. You just do it because it's the right thing to do." The interviewer nodded. "And you think that's something people can actually practice? Being kinder?" "I think," I said, "that most people already want to be. They just talk themselves out of it. They think they're not in a position to help, or they worry it won't matter, or they listen to people who tell them the world doesn't reward kindness." I paused. "Sometimes the world doesn't. I won't lie about that. But sometimes it turns around and gives you everything. I still drive past that convenience store sometimes. The one on Maple and Fifth. It's under different management now, a different chain, different sign, different look. But I know the layout like the back of my hand. I know exactly where the bread shelf was. I know where the counter stood. I know the particular quality of quiet that the store had at 2 in the morning when the fluorescent light buzzed, and the refrigerators hummed and the whole city seemed to be holding its breath. Walter Harrison passed away 3 years ago in October, surrounded by his family. He was 91 years old. He left behind the company a remarkable legacy and a handwritten letter that his daughter forwarded to me. It was not a long letter. Walter was not a man who used more words than necessary. It said, "Jamie, you gave me a role and I gave you a start. but you did the rest yourself. Don't forget that. I keep it in my desk. I take it out sometimes when things are hard. When a grant falls through or a program doesn't go the way I planned, or I start to wonder if I'm doing enough. I unfold it and I read it and I think about a cold January night and a flickering fluorescent light and an old man in a worn coat counting coins on a counter. I think about the woman at Miller's Diner, whose name I never knew, and whose kindness I have been repaying in every way I can for the better part of my adult life. I think about the strange, intricate chain of it, how one person opens a door, and another person walks through it, and years later, they open a door for someone else, and that chain goes on, longer than any of us can see from where we're standing. And I think about what Gerald Fitch said on that cold night in January, standing at the counter with his expensive suit and his certainty. The world doesn't reward kindness. Well, sometimes it does.